Hi, this is the Portland Press Herald News and Opinion Podcast. I'm Jim Patrick, social media editor here at the Press Herald. I'm filling in for Greg Kesich, who has somehow finagled the most cherished vacation time of all, August vacation time in Maine. And on this episode, we will be getting a news roundup on the Maine marijuana industry from Press Herald reporter Penelope Overton. And then, if you stick around, we're going to have columnists Bill Nemitz and Cynthia Dill sit down and talk to us about two very important, very personal, very controversial topics. The quality of the food that you get from food trucks. Is it any good? And also, we're going to look at Susan Collins, who's all of a sudden taking a starring role in the debate over healthcare policy in the United States. And there's a bigger question out there for us Mainers. Will she give up that prominent spot to take a run at the Blaine House? First up, Penelope Overton came into the studio to chat about marijuana with us. I cover beer and she covers marijuana, so we have this weird kinship of covering industries that used to be considered sort of sinful. People think people in the beer industry are just having keg parties every day, and I gotta tell you guys, that's not the case. These are just normal people who have normal jobs, who show up to work and work long hours. And I wanted to know, Penelope, the question that's on your mind too, probably, are the people in the marijuana industry just a bunch of stoners?
I don't know that I had a lot of actually preconceptions about what it was going to be like. It just seemed like a brave new world to me. And so I was trying to not walk in with the, stoner stereotype.
Right.
I also cover lobsters. I know from
You don't cover
that
lobsters,
experience.
you cover the lobster industry.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, true. Although I spend enough time with the little boogers, it feels like it. But I think that I learned there that, all the stereotypes that you might have about lobstermen, throw half those out the window and the other half are actually just kind of shows that the guys are putting on because they think you're expecting that. But there are families, who have grow operations on their farms. It's also the industry is somewhat stemming or growing up from the medical marijuana scene here. And, there's like 3,800 or so, caregivers in the state. Nobody knows exactly how many. And so there's a wide variety of caregivers out there, but a lot of those are family-run operations, and they know their patients really, really well. So I think that kind of told me that you were going to see a different kind of thing. Now, there's a lot of out-of-state people that are starting to kind of nose around in Maine as well. So there's a new crew coming in.
Looking for investment opportunities, right? Yeah.
Yes. It's a big industry nationally, and it's growing really fast. And so it looks as if, Maine is going to be the first one to actually get their retail shops open. Massachusetts is really like neck and neck, but they seem to, they seem like they're ahead of us. And then there's a setback that comes through that seems like it's pushing their shops back. So it could be that Massachusetts actually opens before we do, but it's just as likely that we will. And so there's a lot of folks from out of state that want to get a leg into New England in whatever state happens to come first, and half of them are betting on Maine.
Well, let's dive into this. You said the wild, wild west, and I love that term because it seems like I've been reading the stories, and it seems like it's playing out that way. The state has been, well, I don't want to characterize it as anything, but I keep waiting to see what rules come out of this, and they haven't done much, right? The legislators, they haven't actually made many rules regarding marijuana yet.
No. So once the initiative was approved and signed by Governor LePage, they set up this committee, and you have 17 members that have been learning right along with me, actually. I mean, some of them had some previous knowledge of the industry. They had done due diligence before the initiative. But most of them are sitting at the committee meetings asking questions like, what's a dab? What's this? What's that? How does this work? How do you grow? So it's great for me because I can sit in and I'm not the only one raising my hand going, what's a dab? You've got people in suits doing the same thing. But they're having a lot of learning curve going on. And so, there's really only been 3 bills that have come out of it. One of them was to delay the implementation of the majority of the referendum question. Basically, you are allowed to do home grow at this time, but you can't you can smoke it, but you can't buy it,
Yep.
like legally. So, but all the retail shops, the social clubs, all that part of the initiative has been delayed until next year.
So gets towards the $1 million question. And is there any sense when a store will be open in this state? Just ballpark approximately when somebody could go into a shop and hand over some money and get marijuana?
Well, it's always up for another delay, but they've been saying February of 2018. There's still a lot to do. The committee has been agreeing on certain things by consensus, where they do a straw poll, not official vote, but do we all agree on this? But they can change their minds, and they've done so several times, which makes it challenging when you're writing stories because you think, I'm writing this story this week, but they could come back in 3 weeks when somebody's read that report out of wherever saying, don't count your marijuana plants, decide how much someone can grow by canopy. And suddenly all of that gets changed and they reverse their consensus and they're doing something different.
And by canopy, real quick, means in a grow house? Is that,
it's talking about cultivation rules for commercial operations. And so they have to decide how they're going to measure. And really, actually, at this moment, the consensus is there will be no cap, which would be very unusual. Maine would be the one state that doesn't have an actual cap on how much could be grown. Instead, it would be just basically that they're looking at how much each individual is growing so we can decide what to tax you at. And that actually, one of the things that they'll be doing this Friday at their next meeting, which is supposed to be kind of starting to wrap it up, they will be deciding license tiers, like whether you might have, say, a specific license that is set up for, say, like a craft grower, a small operation. They wouldn't have as much, tax, wouldn't be as much of a licensing fee, but you would be limited to a certain number of plants that you'd be able to grow. And then right up to the big boys, that would be, and I'm not sure what the upper limit's going to be. They've kicked around a lot of numbers, but you'd have up to like X plants or X number of square feet that you could grow. You'd pay the maximum license fee and application fee, and you'd be set to go.
And did I get this straight that they just recently, did they decide on a tax rate, or they've decided what they think the tax rate is going to be? Tell us about that. What are the numbers?
Right. So the committee voted in that non-voting kind of way to set a 20% tax rate, a 10% sales tax that you or I would pay at the time of purchase, and a 10% wholesale or excise tax that would be paid by the cultivator when they sold to a retail shop. Now that is generally built into the price of marijuana. So you'd have right now in Maine, of course, there's a variety of, depending on where you buy it, but an ounce of marijuana costs about $200. And so you would have basically a $40 tax that would be put on that, 20 of which you and I would never see, but we would feel, and 20 of which we would pay at the time of purchase.
So they're coming up with some structures. They're thinking February 2018. Is there anybody that's on track to actually be open at that point?
There are a lot of folks that are kind of ready to go. So you have caregivers that are ready to that now supply patients that are registered in the medical marijuana program that are ready to make the jump into retail. You have actually the biggest dispensary in the state, the medical dispensary, Wellness Connection, has made its intentions clear that they would like to go into the recreational market as well. Just because of the size of their operation, they're really they're well heeled. They've got a good system going. They're likely to be one of the first ones in as well. But it all depends on who the state licenses. So at this point, you can want to get into it, but it depends on what the state, who gets a license from the state and who has the investors.
So it's coming into focus, but we're not there yet.
No.
And one thing on the flip side, I know you got a story coming up about this soon, or coming out now if you're listening to this on Tuesday. We are talking about also the home growers, and it's a funny story. A friend of mine this spring, it's just funny to me to talk casually about this the way people do, but I asked a friend what he planted in his garden, and he said cucumbers and squash, and he's got some pot in there as well. And it was a very offhanded reference to, well, hey, if they made it legal, I'm going to grow it in my garden. What are you hearing about those home growers and any restrictions on them? What is that starting to look like for people?
So right now, because that's the one part of the initiative that was not delayed by, there was no moratorium, they have the ability to grow 6 mature plants at any one time. And they will, under a proposal that was approved by the committee that still has to go to the full legislature and be debated and whatnot, and I expect this will have a big public hearing appeal, they would be limiting the amount of marijuana that can be grown on any one piece of property. So you or I could still grow our 6 plants, but if you and I live together, we would not be able to grow more than 12 plants on the property. And that's fine if it's just you and me, but if it's you and me and your brother, now we suddenly have, a problem. We all can't grow our 6 plants. Somebody has to give it up. Right. Now, say if your brother was the last one at the table, he could still grow his 6 on someone else's property with that that landowner's written permission. But that property could only have 12 as well. So that means that somebody who lives in Portland, who lives in an apartment complex, or just like, double decker or whatever, and doesn't have permission to grow or space to even grow, or doesn't want to do the indoor grow in the closet kind of thing. So they are now limited to where they can grow. They can find somebody who's willing to host marijuana on their property out in the sticks someplace. But that means that they can't grow, essentially. So that would be a big thing, and that's different than the initiative and what people are expecting.
And my last question along those lines, Penny, is there any sense that law enforcement can actually oversee this type of thing? Are they actually going to count how many people live in a house, and if it's somebody living by themselves but growing 12 plants, are the cops going to knock on that guy's door? Or is there an appetite for that kind of enforcement?
So I think that right now, again, the rules could be changed, but the rules as they say now is that everybody has to ID their plants. Well, every mature plant, which means like it's either flowering or it's 12 inches or high or 12 inches wide. That's the definition of mature. They have to ID their plant. And that means your name, your address, if it's not your property, and your driver's license. And you have to have a Maine driver's license to do it. The police officer could, decide to get down on their hands and knees and check the tags. And if they don't match up, then yeah, you're busted.
Just to follow up on that, Penny, does that mean the DEA could also get involved hypothetically if the federal government had interest in seeing how many plants people are growing?
Well, marijuana is still not legal under federal law, and everybody in the industry and anybody who grows is probably waiting to see what Attorney General Jeff Sessions is going to do. They haven't issued any new rules or memos that basically outlines it. We have Governor LePage here inviting in Sessions to come down to Maine and crack down on marijuana grows here. So when the governor of a state invites the federal government to come in and crack down on marijuana, I think you have to kind of take that seriously. That said, a lot of the growers here are currently in the medical marijuana industry, and I think that's a tough row to hoe for somebody to come in and say, we're going to take medicine away from sick people. I'm not saying that they won't try to do that, but I think that would be a pretty unpopular move. The medical program here is considered to be very successful, and it's very popular with voters. So.
All right, Penny. Well, thanks for coming in today. I'm sure we're going to have you come in and talk some more as this wild, wild west evolves into a slightly more organized west. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Coming up, listeners, in just 1 second, Bill Nemitz, Cynthia Dill, healthcare. It's been an unusually nationally driven week for us. A lot of times we have a lot more local news being generated, but we'll get to all that. The most important searing issue to talk about today is food trucks. We had a big story on the Press Herald website last week about mashed potato food truck. A teacher quit her job teaching children and opened a food truck. And I have this theory. The fact that it's coming off a food truck makes it taste better to people somehow, because how could it possibly be good? It's coming off of a food truck. In fact, the food isn't that good off most food trucks. I have had one decent meal off a food truck. It was poutine from Pinky D's Poutine. I'm sure they're not listening to this. They don't strike me as the kind of folks that are hanging around listening to podcasts, and that is their loss.
They're too busy.
They are too busy. They were slammed over at the Summer Session Beer Festival. So food trucks, overrated or underrated, is kind of where I start off today. And I think food trucks in general are overrated. The food that I would rather go to a restaurant and get a decent meal from a restaurant than go to a food truck.
Well, you've just hit on my number one problem with them. And I think you're right. I think it's the carbon monoxide, by the way, that makes you taste the food better. But you stand in line, sometimes for a long time, and then you get your food, and then what? You stand there on the sidewalk and eat it? Where do you go?
Yeah, I have a theory. I have a theory, and that is that food truck food tastes better often because consumers of it are inebriated.
They were at the summer session beer festival on Saturday. There might have been a dozen food trucks there, and I bet people were raving about the food. So that makes sense.
And the other thing is they're a step up from the hot dog carts.
Do you have a favorite food truck? I have Pinky D's.
Well, I always went to Mark's, in Tommy's Park.
Sure. He's still there.
I know. He's been there for, 35 years, I think
like
now? So, you get used to that year after year, and then all of a sudden somebody's serving up fish tacos. It's a little different.
Have you had Sugar, the artisan donuts? That is the one food truck I would accept.
I'm not a huge regular of food trucks, although in my hometown of Cape Elizabeth, we've for years debated whether or not food trucks should be allowed at Fort Williams, and we have them this year, and I think it's added a nice dimension.
Oh, it's a beautiful setting. That Bite into Maine food truck is sitting right there.
Yeah, but it's gelato.
Yeah, lobster rolls.
Yeah, lobster rolls and gelato. Okay, moving on to real issue of the day, healthcare and Maine's role in that process of the Senate health bill, which apparently has been killed as of last week. Talk a little bit, Cynthia, about your reaction. You're a political commentator. This past week, it was kind of remarkable, wasn't it, what happened in Washington?
It was remarkable. It was ridiculous and remarkable. I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Ron Johnson offering up to the Speaker of the House, look, guys, if we'll vote for this, if you don't vote for it, that way we can have a conference. And if that worked, I think I would have been just really disgusted. Thankfully, it didn't. But the healthcare, I predicted that John McCain's personal experience with cancer perhaps would move the needle as far as his voting was concerned. And I was certainly pleased that he provided the third no vote that killed the bill. I guess I was a little troubled that he was hailed such a hero for voting for such a bad bill. I mean, everybody should have voted against it. Nobody had read it. The CBO hadn't scored it. It would have affected, depending on who you believe, between 15 and 17 million people, and gutted Planned Parenthood and Medicaid. So the fact that people are heroes for voting against it, I think, is just a sign of the times. But it's not over, in my view.
You think they're going to come back at this? There's some talk that if John McCain doesn't return to the Senate and somebody's appointed to fill his seat if he was to pass away, that they would come back at this. You think there's going to be another run at it?
Well, there's precedent in the House. The House, failed. They didn't actually bring it to a vote. The Speaker pulled the vote at the last minute, and everyone thought it was dead, or there was news around it being dead, and then it revived itself with what ultimately passed and was celebrated, even though it's going nowhere in terms of the Senate. So I don't think it's an issue that the Republicans can just drop completely. So it'll be interesting to see, what now rises from the ashes. Hopefully it's what Senator Collins has been calling for, and others, level-headed people, for a bipartisan approach with committee hearings and expert testimony and a real sitting around the table pounding out some details that would actually be good policy as opposed to good politics.
Mm-hmm.
Which has begun, I'm happy to say. I'm not sure where this is going, but there's yet another caucus, the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a group of about 40 members of Congress on either side of the aisle. And they've met all weekend and have come up today, I believe, it's kind of a list of principles. It's not a list of specific proposals, but going into what a bipartisan negotiation on health care would look like. Here are the issues, mostly that they're looking for common ground on just a conceptual level. And what I love about this is that for once, and again, I'm not, no guarantees on where this is going, but what I do like about it is that they're finally sitting down and identifying areas of common ground and talking in terms of principles before they jump in and start writing legislation. So it's a big step back in terms of immediacy, but if you want to get back to what guys like McCain were saying last week about, whatever having to process, I think it's a big gain in that regard, and I'm hoping it gets some traction. It sounded pretty positive to me, and who knows what might come out of it.
Isn't the clock kind of running, though, on this, though? I hate to be a pragmatist, but that is my default setting. We have about probably less than a year until the re-election campaigns really fire up for 2018. The winds seem to be blowing in favor of Democrats at this point. If Republicans want to get something done, even in a bipartisan manner or just among themselves, they got to get going.
Yeah, I think a more immediate concern, though, is what the insurance companies are going to do. So you got two things going on. You got the midterms looming over all of this, but at the same time, you've got these insurance companies that are essentially being chased out of the market by the Trump administration right now. And so, you can talk about these so-called inevitable implosion or collapse of Obamacare, but there are ways you can juice that, and it's being juiced left and right now. So, yeah, I think, on the one hand, the Democrats, there could be an incentive there to wait until they control the show and they can have, Obamacare 2.0. But the question is, what's going to happen in the marketplace in the interim? And
and I think going into the election, it's going to be who's to blame for either what's wrong with healthcare at that time or who can get credit for what's right. And generally, the numbers in terms of Obamacare, of course, it was unpopular for a while, but then when it was threatened to be lost, many people realized this is pretty good. And the polling on Obamacare actually went over 50% for the first time, I believe. And now, as Bill indicated, the Trump administration has said it is intending to intentionally manipulate things to kind of kill Obamacare. And if the reporting on that is good and shows actual steps taken by the Trump administration to undermine a healthcare law that's in place to provide health insurance for low-income Americans and for ordinary Americans, I think that's a gain for Democrats. If somehow, though, Obamacare does crash and burn, and Republicans can then say, see,
everybody loses.
Yeah, everybody loses.
By the way, those people, they were opposed to Obamacare, but they always loved the Affordable Care Act. That was why those numbers switched.
There's stories on social media about guys saying, I don't have Obamacare, I have the ACA.
Yeah,
right. Did you not know?
Or, I hate government, but keep your hands off my Medicare.
Exactly.
It's they're contradictions. Those numbers are riddled with contradictions.
Right. I hate socialized medicine, but I've signed up for Medicare at age 65. That happens. Well, let's zoom in on what this means for Maine when we talk about killing off Obamacare, what a death spiral looks like or anything like that. Insurers in Maine are posting about 20% rate hikes for next year for Obamacare and or the ACA, if you prefer. We are on the hook for some portion of that as people, as taxpayers who are subsidizing these people's health insurance, right? And this is not just a story about people paying 20%
Yeah,
more. That's
true, and that's the tension that I talked about. I mean, we're headed for some real turbulence here, and you got to remember this is the individual market, and people hear that rates going up 20%. Well, not if you have employer-provided health care, that's going to be negotiated. So we're talking about the people who are out there on their own in the individual market, a lot of whom rely on subsidies, and so there is going to be this attrition over the next 12 months in which people are going to drop out of the market, I think primarily at this point because the tax penalty is going to be outweighed by the premium increase.
Or unenforced.
Right. But the thing that people have to remember is that health insurance premiums were skyrocketing before Obamacare. So it's not like it's going up 20% and that's new. It had been rising dramatically. It's just that now people are faced with higher premiums, but they have insurance and they have subsidies to help pay for those premiums. What the Trump administration can do to undermine Obamacare without Congress, helping is to screw up these subsidies. So then people are really
they drop
feeling the pinch.
But you just hit the nail on the head with the big enchilada here is not health insurance.
Right.
It's the cost of health care.
The rising cost of
and
health care.
So as Congress now steps back and tries to hit the reset button, I talked to Angus King about this on Friday, and I think he's right on the money. He says he's either sponsoring or co-sponsoring 10 pieces of legislation right now that address this, but many of them don't go to the insurance side as much as they go to the cost of health care. So I think that the two have to be negotiated in tandem, and you can't deal with a new, Obamacare light, whatever it's going to be, without also addressing that underlying cause of skyrocketing health costs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cost of health care, there's a disconnect that has to be renegotiated. The incentives around health care are just wacky. I mean, healthcare providers are incented to do very expensive tests and procedures because there's
prescription drugs.
And because there's guaranteed payment by insurance, and it's a system that doesn't work. We're the only country that uses this broken system, and what we need is cooler heads in Washington to do, as Bill suggested, they're hopefully doing, sit around a table and hammer out some broad principles that everyone can agree on about, driving down the cost of insurance, providing the right incentives for providers, and getting more people in the market to reduce costs overall.
It's funny how none of us were sure.
I just put mine on jet on the airport.
I did.
I think I'm on.
Sorry about that.
Isn't there, as we talk about this, Cynthia, you've been following this very closely. It seems like there's some really diametrically opposed organizations where what's good for a hospital or what's good for an insurer isn't necessarily good for somebody who makes prescription drugs. This is what did Donald Trump say a few months ago? Who knew healthcare could be so tough? Talk a little about the complications here.
Well, I'm certainly no expert, but clearly there are complications because we have a market that, in terms of prescription drugs, that the government has insurance essentially for prescription drugs, but doesn't negotiate contracts with the drug companies and doesn't take advantage of the economies of scale. And so Americans therefore pay just substantially higher prices for prescription drugs. I know people who are married to doctors who go to Canada to get prescription drugs because they're
more affordable.
Just more affordable. Yeah. So the prescription drug law is another example of the inability of Congress to come together around some principles. I mean, some common sense things like, why would you not negotiate with drug companies when you're the United States government? Why would you give that pass to Big Pharma? But that's just a huge lobbying influence. So money in politics, I think, is the real complicating factor because the organizations that need to change and need to be regulated resist, and they're a powerful resistance. So we've got just the political money and politics problem. But then healthcare itself, because of this disconnect and this system that we have of providing incentives to providers to do more tests, to do more procedures. And there's, for the consumer, the person, if you knew how much things cost, you might not necessarily agree to it. But you go
There's
into the
also nobody
hospital.
arguing or lobbying on that side of things, right? Fewer tests.
Well, there
fewer
are, but they're not nearly as effective as the pharmaceutical companies.
Right. Maine has done like a couple of good things. I don't know, maybe they've been undone recently by Governor LePage, but like, for instance, it should be that when you go into a hospital that you should be able to compare. Let's see, I'm going to get, a colonoscopy. It's going to cost $5,000 in Portland. It's going to cost $18,000 in Presque Isle. It's going to cost, $600 down in Boston. You should be able to compare.
Well, you can do that, but it's a hard thing to do. I mean, because I get regular CT scans, and I know that there are 3 or 4 places here in Portland that provide them, and I know where the cheapest is. And are
you going to share it with us?
Yeah, Marshwood. It's right in Scarborough,
okay.
and it's also good because they have the big wide open one, so you don't freak out when you go into. I'm sorry, I said CAT scans. I mean MRIs.
Oh, okay.
And the point is, you can shop around. However, if you're trying to be responsible to your insurance company, which they urge you to do, and you say, okay, I'll go with the cheapest one. Well, they can't see you for 7 months. I said 7 months. I meant 7 weeks. So the cost factor gets thrown right out the window in place of convenience and scheduling and things like that.
And just the other complicating thing is this inability of Americans, I think, to have a serious conversation about end of life, because such a large proportion of healthcare expenses accrue in the final days of someone's life. And I think if most people were in a competent state of mind and made a decision about whether or not they're going to extend their life for a month, for $500,000, they probably would choose not to. But unfortunately, we don't have a system.
Greg Kesich wrote a great column about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have to just come to terms with that. And around Obamacare, when it was being passed, they raised this, it's a death panel. That sort of shows the power of manipulative politics to move just ridiculous things in the wrong direction. But I think that this as a country, we have to come to grips with end of life and the cost of healthcare associated with the end of life.
Jim, you talked about the ripples. Just to add one thing, the ripples that go out as this extend even beyond the health industry. I found this when I went up to Bridgeton Hospital. Susan Collins found this when she visited Greenville recently to talk about their efforts to reinvigorate their economy. And the first thing on all of these people's minds is the hospital. And not just because it provides health care and helps people who are ill, but because it's the engine of the local economy.
Right, a lot of jobs.
And you've heard national figures. I think healthcare makes up, 1/6 of our economy. But in these small towns in rural Maine, the hospital is it. And so if you start pulling away subsidies and undermining the revenue stream for these hospitals, and God forbid some of them go under, you're driving a stake through that local economy. And there are tons of people that are out of work, and those pre-existing, to coin a phrase, problems just snowball. And so there's a lot more at stake here than just healthcare.
And I would even point out that a lot of those outlying hospitals are Republican strongholds that we're talking about.
People who voted for Trump. That's correct.
So right at the center of all this has been Susan Collins, and she got in the headlines just for arriving at the airport in Bangor. I don't know that we'll get to that. We're trying to wrap up here, but Bill, you just talked to Susan Collins over the weekend
on Friday.
And what's her reaction been to this being kind of at the center of this storm?
I think she's handled it pretty well. I think that
Does she like it at all? Does she like being?
I think she has kind of a love-hate relationship with it. I think there are parts of it that she does like. I think that in terms of building a legacy, I think this is going to be very useful to her. I think there are times, however, when I think the part she doesn't like is probably what happens in the Senate Republican caucus, and because things are getting pretty nasty there toward her, toward Murkowski. I think Lindsey Graham can handle it because to him, he can turn anything into a joke. But there are some very, very hard feelings down there. But I think that she, on this issue, on this particular progression of legislation, has been remarkably consistent. I mean, she was. I'm going back to the motion to proceed.
Yep.
And then the two iterations that followed that finally.
And she never gave any indication that she was wavering.
No, she didn't. And there was a lot. And she was getting worked mostly by Pence and Priebus. She didn't have any one-on-ones with Trump. She had that famously awkward luncheon with him where Murkowski was on one side and she was on the other. And I told her, I said, you didn't look real comfortable in that photo. And she says, well, yeah, I know. I gotta work on being more relaxed. But she looked like she just ate a bad oyster, sitting next to him. It was horrible. So I think she comes out of this looking very good. She's going to be more vilified by the Tea Party right, and but how much more can they hate her? And I think that there are a lot of people who she won over politically with her actions last week, that whatever she chooses to do going down the road, it's going to benefit her.
She has been consistent, but I would say one thing we saw that's different with Senator Collins is that she had in the past always given a go to the vote. Like she would let the vote proceed on the procedural level to give, the sponsor of the legislation the opportunity to have an up or down vote. And in this time she didn't. And I think it's remarkable, her rise in stature. I mean, for a while, the moderate Republican from the Northeast was practically extinct. And, Angus King ran on, being a bridge, and she actually has been the most independent voice. And as a result of her not supporting Trump and being consistent in, I think, her personal relationships down in Washington, she separates the personal from the policy. She never really engages, with the minor exception of, so I think she's just really in a comfortable place. She's one of the most powerful people in Washington, and the question just becomes now, what does she do with that? Yeah,
right,
and
exactly.
She's got a lot of options.
It's amazing how much news there is around this that we don't even really have time to dive into that exchange yet with the Texas representative.
Well, that'll keep us occupied for the next 2 years.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, there's plenty of time to people have discussed that to death. It's interesting to me that her profile is so high because for years I've lived outside of Maine and people would refer to her as the other senator from Maine because they could only remember Olympia Snowe. Now she's this prominent figure. Does she parlay this into a gubernatorial run?
Well, a lot of people think that it's a slam dunk that she's going to do that now, and that's what this is all about. I personally don't.
I don't either.
I think that she has, as you just mentioned, Cynthia, she's got a lot of capital, a lot of it freshly minted by what just happened. And, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that she could chair the Appropriations Committee or ranking member, whatever happens in the midterm. I mean, she is on an ascendant curve right now in terms of the Senate. And the only possible reason I could see her running for governor would be if she sees it as a kind of capstone to her political legacy, plus the fact that she lost in 1994.
I was about to say she ran in the primary and took third in the primary.
And that was the only.
Yeah.
That was
Nothing
the only
wrong with that.
only race she's ever lost. So that I think that's still kind of a burr for her. But if I had to bet right now, I wouldn't bet a lot. Number one, but I would probably bet that she's not going to do it.
Okay. What do you think, Cynthia?
I agree with Bill. I just don't see it high. Maybe if you had asked me, before November, I would have thought that she may be planning a capstone to her very illustrious political career. But now things have changed. I mean, she really is a very powerful person, and she has the ability to really shape some huge national policies and international policies. And I just can't imagine going from that to the Blaine House.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this afternoon. Thanks very much for coming in, Cynthia, and thanks very much for agreeing with me about food trucks.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thank you.
All right, have a good one.
You too.
And thank you for listening to the Press Herald podcast. You can subscribe to our weekly episodes on iTunes and Android, as well as streaming us on Stitcher. Please rate and review us if you think we're good. If not, send a link to one of your enemies. Send questions or comments via email to letterstotheeditor@pressherald.com. Lastly, you can find older episodes, including more interviews with more reporters and more coverage of Medicaid, the opioid epidemic, and city politics at pressherald.com/podcast. Talk to you again next week.